On December 31st, 1997, at a New Year's Eve party broadcast on live TV, Sheryl Sheppard accepted a marriage proposal from her boyfriend, Michael Lavoy. 2 days later, Sheryl Sheppard disappeared.
In 1998, I'd like to ask you to marry me, Sheryl. Marriage
I
proposal!
can't believe this!
And now it's turned into a soft porn film. Hey,
Right, this is
what
my
was the answer?
TV. Yes.
The answer was yes. We have
Let's
a
hear it.
love connection.
Another love connection.
That's about the third one tonight, and I'll tell you, that's an advertisement for Jack Daniels.
Sheryl Sheppard was 29 when she disappeared on or around January 2nd, 1998. She is described as a blue-eyed blonde with big hair. She was pretty and known to turn heads. Sheryl was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 105 pounds. She is described as very tiny. Sheryl liked to go horseback riding, paintballing, and she liked sports. Sheryl was born and raised in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which is known as the Steel Town, the Hammer, and the Armpit. Sheryl and her sister Sheila were raised by their single mother, Odette Fisher. Sheryl and Odette were very close, and Odette was even living with Sheryl at the time of her disappearance. Sheryl had been dating Michael Lavoy for about 2 years. When they first met, he quickly moved in with Sheryl and her mother. They lived in a 7th-floor apartment on 851 Queenston Avenue, Hamilton. Mike has 2 daughters from a previous relationship, and reportedly Sheryl enjoyed a close relationship with them. But Mike was known as a loner and a strange guy. He was reportedly very possessive over Sheryl. Sheryl was working at the Tim Hortons at Sanford Avenue North and Cannon Street East in Hamilton, and Mike would go there while Sheryl was working and stay for her 8-hour shift. Sheryl's boss had to ask him to leave because he was making people uncomfortable. And Sheryl told her mother that he was coming to her work and harassing her to the point where she couldn't even concentrate on her job. Sheryl had been married twice before getting with Mike. Both marriages were short, and reportedly both of these men ran in the same circles and were allegedly friends. But it's important to note here that both of Sheryl's former husbands were cleared of involvement in her disappearance. One of them immediately came forward to request a polygraph test so the police could be sure he was not involved. Allegedly, Sheryl had danced as a stripper in her younger years, but had given that up about 6 years before she disappeared. And that is important to note here because of what Mike Lavoy would later claim Sheryl did on the night that she did disappear. So on New Year's Eve 1997, the night Mike proposed to Sheryl, her mom Odette was back east in New Brunswick visiting family, and even though she had spoken to her daughter on New Year's Day, Sheryl didn't tell her that Mike had proposed. Sheryl was supposed to pick Odette up at the Union Station in Toronto on January the 4th. But Sheryl never arrived. Odette called her, she left a message, but still no Sheryl. So after waiting for some time, Odette made her way home. And this is where it all started. Once home, Odette realized Sheryl wasn't there either. Usually Sheryl would leave a message on paper for her mom, but there wasn't one. Odette knew something was off. Mike then came home, and when Odette asked about Sheryl, he told her he hadn't seen Sheryl in 2 days. Mike put Sheryl's keys on the counter and said she had left them on the seat of her car. Odette, obviously panicked, phoned the police and was told to wait overnight, and that if she didn't hear anything by the morning, then to call back and put in a missing persons report. While in bed that night, Odette heard Mike fooling around with papers, and then he left. Odette went to work the next morning, but she couldn't stay because she was just too worried about Sheryl. Odette called the police back to file a missing persons report. She was then told to go home and they would be there and don't touch anything else. When she returned home, Odette noticed that Mike's things were all gone, all of his clothes and his hockey equipment. Then Odette remembered that she had noticed upon her return from New Brunswick that one of Mike's hockey bags was missing. She didn't really think much of it at the time, but remembered asking Mike about the bag, and he became agitated. At some point, it was realized that not only did Sheryl not show up to pick her mother up, she hadn't shown up for her shift at the Tim Hortons on New Year's Day. Reportedly, her manager had called and left a message for Sheryl saying that she was fired for not showing up. The police would later say that they had not found this message, but it is possible that Sheryl had already heard it before she went missing. What police did find on the answering machine was a message from Mike to Sheryl that was made on the Friday afternoon or evening of January the 2nd. This message hadn't been heard by Sheryl. Police spent 10 days scouring the apartment at 851 Queenston Road for clues, and have not revealed what, if anything, may have been discovered there. When Odette returned home, there were pen circles all over the hallway between Sheryl's bedroom door and her bedroom door, about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. Was it blood splatter? We don't know. Police also noticed the curtains in the living room were not held up by a rod, but rather nailed to the wall. Odette noted that the curtains were not that way when she left for her holiday. Most alarming was that police noticed Sheryl's glasses and contacts were left at the apartment, as well as her wallet. Sheryl had bad eyesight and needed either her glasses or her contacts to function. She could not go without them. So finding her glasses and contacts at home was a major red flag that something bad had happened to Sheryl. Reportedly, nothing of evidence value was found in either car that Mike did have access to. A witness would come forward to report that Sheryl and Mike were seen together at a bingo hall earlier in the day of January the 2nd. The witness was an employee who seen them between 9 and 12 that morning. This is the last confirmed sighting of Sheryl. When police confronted Michael Lavoy, he would go on to tell them a story full of holes and inconsistencies. But unbelievably, since Sheryl has disappeared, Mike has spent less than 30 minutes speaking to the police and has refused all other interviews. Mike claimed he dropped Sheryl off at a hotel in Niagara Falls around 7 p.m. on January 2nd, where he said she would be working as an exotic dancer. It's important to note here that the manager of the club has said to have never seen Sheryl before, and that she wasn't there that night either. Mike initially claimed Sheryl's friend was going to pick her up. Then later he insisted that her ex-husband, Brian Sweeney, was supposed to pick her up. Mike promised to follow up at the station with the police the next day, but of course he was a no-show, so the police tried to track him down. When he was found later, on January the 7th, he was hiding inside a storage facility with the engine of his vehicle running, an apparent suicide attempt via carbon monoxide poisoning. It would come out later that Mike Lavoy had sent his mother a suicide note in the mail before the incident at the storage facility. Mike said he dropped Sheryl off at the hotel in Niagara Falls. He then went to Chippewa between 7 and 7:30, picked up his 2 daughters, and dropped them at his mother, Pat's house. Mike's mother, Pat, says that Mike told her he went back to pick Sheryl up, but she wasn't there. Meanwhile, Mike told police that Sheryl had a ride home with her ex, and then Odette says Pat told her that Mike said Sheryl was home the night he supposedly dropped her off. Mike obviously was having a hard time keeping his story straight. Mike's children said that on the night of Sheryl's disappearance, he took them to a parking lot and told them a story about an ex-murderer. Then he drove them to the apartment and told them to stay in the car. The children stated that he went into the apartment and then came out a little while later and took the kids into the apartment. Police believe foul play occurred, and in 2008, Michael Lavoy was officially named as the person of interest by the head of the homicide unit. Michael Lavoy never reported Sheryl missing. He also told several conflicting stories to his mother, Sheryl's mother, and his ex-partner, sometimes saying Sheryl was sleeping, other times alleging she was at work. Mike Lavoy hasn't taken part in any searches for Sheryl or made any pleas for Sheryl's safe return. All red flags. Mike was offered a lie detector test by police, but he refused, and hasn't spoken to police since his initial interview. The landlord for Sheryl's apartment recalled seeing Mike struggle with 2 large garbage bags the weekend of Sheryl's disappearance. Allegedly, Mike told him he was carrying out laundry because Sheryl was sick and he needed to do the laundry at the laundromat. Just a quick note here, this happened before Odette had reported Sheryl missing. Just after Sheryl disappeared, Mike started dating a woman named Sheila Darbison, who had been in a long-term relationship with Mike Lavoy's stepbrother. Sheila claimed the relationship between her and Mike started in October of 1997. Sheryl Sheppard went missing less than 3 months later, around January 2nd, 1998. But Sheila says that nothing happened between her and Mike until a few weeks after Sheryl had disappeared. Mike stayed with Sheila Darbison immediately after Sheryl's disappearance. And Sheila alleges that Mike had a lot of scratches on his back, which took a long time to heal, and that he had a bite mark on his arm. Mike told Sheila not to talk to the police and don't trust anyone. She complied and never did speak to the police. Sheila and Mike did eventually split, and years later, Sheila would publish a book that she didn't actually proceed with because Sheryl's family didn't approve of it. But nonetheless, police believe there is some substance to Sheila's claims. For instance, the bite mark. Allegedly, police had a search warrant for Mike while he was in the hospital after his attempted suicide in the storage locker. This search warrant would have allegedly given police a clear view of his body. But when the police arrived at the hospital, Mike had just left. I don't understand why, if this claim is true, why couldn't the police just go after him at home or whatever? I also don't understand why police were not able to force Mike to come in for questioning again, especially when he was officially named as their lead suspect in 2008. There are numerous reports that the relationship between Sheryl and Mike was tumultuous and that Mike Lavoy had a history of domestic abuse. For instance, Mike's former partner, Gwen, the mother of his 2 daughters, said Mike had broken her cheekbones in the past, and he admitted he often fantasized about killing her. In 1995, while at a gas station, Mike told the attendant he had murdered his partner and his kids. He then turned himself into the police, who contacted a very alive Gwen and confirmed Mike had not murdered his family. He was charged with public mischief, but the charges were later withdrawn. And this is what caused their breakup. Prior to her disappearance, Sheryl had told different members of her family that if something happened to her, they knew who to question. Once she even said, quote, "Don't be surprised if I go missing," unquote. Sheryl gave her sister, Sheila, an audio tape with instructions to give it to police if anything ever happened to her. And police have confirmed to CBC that they do have this tape. Odette has reported that she did notice a few times that Sheryl and Mike's relationship was abusive. Though she never actually witnessed Sheryl being hit or being yelled at, she did reportedly witness the aftermath. Odette says that Mike would apologize, he would cook, he would run baths for Sheryl, get Sheryl flowers, and so on. And Odette says she knew it was phony. A friend of Sheryl says that she spoke to Sheryl on the phone just hours after Michael Lavoy's New Year's Eve marriage proposal. The friend claims Sheryl told her she was planning to tell Michael she couldn't marry him. She also claims Sheryl told her she was planning to tell Michael this in a public place so he wouldn't flip out, because he had a temper. This friend also says that Michael had a bad habit of grabbing Sheryl by the throat when they would get into an argument or a fight, and that Sheryl was a little afraid of him. A witness revealed that just weeks before Sheryl disappeared, he saw Mike grab Sheryl by the throat and lift her nearly off her feet in the underground parking garage at 851 Queenston Road. Allegedly, Mike threatened Sheryl, saying, quote, "If you keep fucking around with me, something's going to happen to you," unquote. 2 separate sources also reveal that Michael Lavoy may have been blackmailing Sheryl with a compromising videotape or tapes. And friends claim Sheryl would hide herself as she was dressing around this time, possibly trying to hide bruises. And it wasn't like her to do this before. She would just go ahead and undress, but around this time it was like she was trying to cover up. Sheryl's friends questioned why anyone would believe Mike's version of the night Sheryl disappeared. Like I have said, Mike was known to be extremely possessive of Sheryl, even hanging out at the Tim Hortons where she worked, just sitting there and staring at her and anyone who talked to her, especially men. It was so bad that the other employees were uncomfortable. Now, does this really sound like a man who would then turn around and drop Sheryl off alone to go strip in front of other men, and then let her ex-husband pick her up? Not very likely. Numerous ground searches and public pleas for help in locating Sheryl have turned up nothing. No trace of Sheryl has ever been found. Police say they believe Sheryl was murdered and that her body has never been found. An unproven rumor that Sheryl will never be found because Mike put her body through a wood chipper persists to this day. Reportedly, there is not enough information to charge Michael Lavoy with Sheryl Sheppard's murder, and police have faced a lot of frustration surrounding persons close to Mike. Apparently, this group is very tight-knit, and there probably are people who do know something, but they have chosen not to come forward. Police say there have never been any other suspects. No other information has ever come forward to make someone else a suspect. Hamilton police also have their doubts about whether Sheryl made it to Niagara Falls that night. In 2011, Sheryl's case got some publicity by increasing the reward for information about Sheryl from $10,000 to $50,000. A CBC true crime podcast from 2016 titled Someone Knows Something, or SKS, by David Ridgen, breathed new life into the investigation into Sheryl's disappearance. I highly recommend this podcast. Since its airing, a petition calling on Hamilton police to step up their efforts to find out what happened to Sheryl was made, and the petition got more than 9,000 signatures. Odette doesn't think her daughter is alive because they were so close, and she is convinced that Mike had something to do with her daughter's murder. And anybody with any information about Sheryl's disappearance is asked to call the Hamilton Police Homicide Unit at 905-546-2458 or 905-546-3843 and reference agency case number 98-501950.